Death by boiling was one of the worst punishments in history. The idea of boiling a human being alive calls to mind an image of terrifying barbarians who revel in slowly torturing their victim, or we might think of savage cannibals on a small island preparing their gruesome dinner. But truth be told, the practice of boiling people alive is not that alien. Less than 500 years ago, boiling alive was a punishment used in Europe as well. It was intended for particularly serious offenses such as counterfeiting money, poisoning, or exceptionally violent crimes. If we imagine the pain even a small splash of hot oil causes on our skin, the agony of being immersed in boiling liquid is unimaginable. Depending on place, time, and severity of the offense, different variations of the punishment were practiced. Usually, the tool of choice was a large copper cauldron filled with water, oil, tallow, wax, lead, or wine. However, the condemned person was not simply thrown into the liquid. Sometimes, the torture would be prolonged by tying the victim up in cold water, which was then gradually brought to the boil. In some cases, those condemned were hung upside down and immersed with their heads first, or in other cases, their knees were tied to their chest so that their butt plunged into the boiling liquid first, and sometimes they were simply hung in the steam horizontally. Probably the earliest reference of this form of execution are found in the martyr stories of Christian saints. For example, Saint Antipas is said to have been executed in a bull-shaped vessel, and the tale goes that John the Evangelist was boiled in oil during the persecution of Christians under the reign of Emperor Domitian. Saint Vitus is also often depicted in a cauldron of boiling oil, but according to legend, he was saved at the last moment by angels. One of the best documented cases of an execution by boiling is the case of one Richard Druze, who was executed in Smithfield, London in 1531. We know only very little about this man except that he was the cook of the Bishop of Rochester. One day, in winter of 1531, he prepared porridge for his master and his guests in the kitchen of the bishop's palace in Lambeth March. As was customary, the leftovers were distributed to the poor and needy. Soon after, the alarm bell was ringing. All those who had eaten from the porridge suddenly fell seriously ill. One of the beggars even died a while later. For unknown reasons, the bishop himself had not eaten of the porridge and took no harm. Investigations revealed that the porridge had been poisoned, and Druze was arrested and questioned. He admitted that he had mixed laxatives into the food as a joke, but with no ill intent. King Henry VIII, yes, the one with all these dead and exiled wives, dealt with the case at the next sitting of the Parliament. The Parliament promulgated the Act for Poisoning, a decree declaring poisoning to be high treason and prescribing in law death by boiling as the appropriate punishment. Such a drastic penalty was chosen because many people, especially the members of the English nobility, were afraid of poison attacks. Whatever the motives, Richard Druze was boiled to death in Smithfield on April 15, 1532, in accordance to the law. The executioner bound him with chains, tied him up on a pulley system that resembled traditional gallows, and slowly dunked the poor cook into a huge cauldron of boiling water 3 times. Because this execution was particularly spectacular, it attracted a huge crowd. One eyewitness described the scene, quote, "He roared mighty loud, and divers women, who were being with child and did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work." End quote. After about 2 hours, Druze finally died. Whether Druze really resorted to poison and why he might have done so is unclear to this day, but some absurd theories surround the story. Malicious tongues claim that the king himself ordered Druze to poison the bishop because he, as a representative of the church, forbade him to divorce Catherine of Aragon, the first of his 6 wives. Only 2 other executions by boiling are known to have taken place in England. In both cases, a woman was accused of poisoning. In 1547, the punishment was already officially abolished. England aside, reports of execution by boiling are found in many places, from Scotland to the Holy Roman Empire and from France to various Asian countries. In Kyoto, for example, the legendary Japanese bandit Ishikawa Goemon is said to have been boiled alive along with his son in 1594, as a punishment for an attempted assassination. In Nuremberg, a clothmaker was executed this way in 1392 for allegedly raping and killing his own mother. And in Stralsund, a counterfeiter was thrown into oil to set a warning example in 1471. In the Dutch city of Deventer, the execution cauldron actually hangs on the wall of the city museum today. In continental Europe, the punishment was in use from the 13th to the 17th century. In contrast to the English law on the continent, it was mainly given to counterfeiters. A contemporary code of law prescribed, quote, "Should a coiner be caught in the act, then let him be stewed in a pan, or in a cauldron half an ell deep for the body, so that the man may be bound to a pole which shall be passed through the rings of the cauldron, and which shall be tightly strapped and bound to upright posts on either side, and thus he shall be made to stew in oil and wine." But not everything always went according to plan. In 1488, in the French city of Tours, a counterfeiter named Louis the Secretary was sentenced to death by boiling, stretching, and hanging. First, the cauldron was filled with cold water and then slowly heated up. When the executioner had tied Louis up, he threw him into the cauldron head first. However, he hadn't done a proper job, and, quote, "as soon as he was thrown in, the cords became so loose that he twice rose to the surface of the water, crying for mercy," end quote. This outraged the people, who feared that Louis's needless suffering would bring disgrace to their town. They attacked the executioner, while the intimidated man tried to push the condemned down under the water with a large iron hook. When Louis kept coming up and remained unharmed nevertheless, some people thought a miracle was happening in front of their eyes. They began attacking the executioner, who was desperately trying to complete his task. The situation escalated to the point that the crowd was beating the executioner to death while pulling Louis out of the cauldron. Afterwards, King Charles VIII pardoned Louis the Secretary as well as the townspeople who killed the executioner, but Louis, quote, "hid himself so completely that he never dared to show his face again," end quote. In the late 16th century, execution by boiling went out of fashion in Europe. In many places, however, it was officially abolished only much later, in France, for example, only in 1791. In 2015, the NGO Human Rights Watch accused the government of Uzbekistan for torturing suspected terrorists to death by boiling them, and ISIS and the cartels of Mexico allegedly still use this method of execution today. The agony of the victims of such an execution is unimaginable. Fortunately, boiling alive has more or less disappeared from the world. It has always been a rare punishment, but now it is even more unlikely than in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance that anyone finds their gruesome death in boiling water, wine, or oil.